There are two things that everyone is getting wrong about the Charlie Kirk situation. The first one, the elephant in the room, is the celebration and glorification of violence. And I'm not even necessarily just talking about murdering someone. Obviously, that's the highest level of violence. And under no circumstances should anyone ever support taking that level of violence against a peaceful person. Charlie Kirk never murdered anyone. He never assaulted anyone. He never raped anyone. At least to my knowledge, he never did any of those violent actions. And there should never be a discussion to violently harm someone who is not violent themselves. Now, I also think it's very important that we denounce the smaller levels of violence that we've seen built up to this point. And it's on both sides. I'm not saying this is just Democrats. I'm not saying it's just Republicans. But the throwing drinks at people, the smacking people's hats, the sending threats to people, the ripping up their signs, this happens on both sides. And those are the small acts of violence, these microaggressions, as corny as that sounds. These microaggressions that get support slowly built up to the level where, maybe there's a large contingent of people that believe that this is okay, and it's not. And we need to nip it in the butt at those first things. When you see people getting violent with any political, really anyone, but specifically people in politics, because that's where people get the most charged, that's where we need to stop it. We can't let it get past that point. When people are celebrating people getting jumped or cursed at in a mob, it's like we have to stop there. But before we should never get to the point where it's even people are getting killed to even have that discussion. That should never happen. So that's the first thing. Any glorification of violence, especially against a person who is peaceful themselves, is irreprehensible. Now, the argument that I've seen, and there's a lot of people making this argument, a lot. It's not a few people. It's not just Chinese bots, because I think to some degree it is Chinese bots. But I have seen people make this argument that speech, hateful speech, has consequences. And I just find that absolutely, absolutely ridiculous. Number one, I would like to point out, the people that say that people that speak hatefully, and I put that in quotes because what does that mean? I have a different definition from you. Everybody's got a different definition of what hateful is. The people that are glorifying the violence, if we were to turn into a third world country, I'm talking about the United States, if we were to turn into a third world country where everybody is just getting assaulted, kidnapped, mugged, killed, those people, mostly women, some men, but for the most part women, they would be the first ones to be victimized. And I think a lot of people need to be aware of their words. If we're going to turn to a society where, even if you're the biggest, the baddest guy that's, a UFC champion, you've got guns, you've got dogs, look, in some spots you're going to be vulnerable. I don't think no one, regardless of how big and how bad you are, nobody should want a society filled with violence. It's just, I don't want to be looking over my shoulder. Am I about to get stabbed? That's nobody wants that. Nobody wants that. Your health and your safety, they're the two most important things. If you don't have your health or your safety, you can have all the money in the world, you can have a great family, you can have a great job. If you've got to look over your shoulder because you might get stabbed, and you've seen 3 people get shot this week, it's not a good lifestyle. You don't want that. And in terms of the hateful rhetoric part, hateful rhetoric gets hateful actions. Look, this is absurd. I really hope no one actually believes this, that if you're mean, and I'll give it to you, I think Charlie Kirk was definitely a rage baiter. He was a bit of a troll. And sometimes he definitely was a bit of a douche. I will say that. By no means, there's some people claiming he's a saint. He's the 13th disciple. I'm not going to go there. He's a political commentator. He says some good stuff. He says some bad stuff. Like anybody else, sometimes he's a little bit of a douche. That's okay. You don't need to die for that. What are we getting into? Once people get... And Charlie Kirk, to some degrees, was a moderate. He was a moderate Republican. So that, I guess that means if you're glorifying him dying, that anybody else on the right can die, which is absurd. And how do we even gauge this? Charlie Kirk was a 6 out of 10 on the hateful scale in 2024, and then he became a 5.5. Okay, now he's a 7. Now he can die. Like, what are we talking about? Joe Biden. And a lot of left-wing people who are supporting Charlie Kirk don't like him either because he's not left-wing enough. But has Joe Biden said hateful things? I'm sure. I've seen him say some hateful things. Does he need to die? It just is completely ludicrous. It's just blatant hypocrisy. Nobody genuinely believes that. And look, Before we get into the free speech argument that I'm about to discuss, which is where I think a lot of right-wingers are getting this wrong, you need to show some grace. You need to just be civilized. Nobody benefits from glorifying violence. Now, that was a critique for a lot of people on the left, which I think is probably a bigger critique than I'm about to get into with the free speech aspect of this. But in times of crisis, there are a few options. But generally, you either have to get significantly better or significantly worse. Something like 9/11. There was a potential for the United States to rally together, and to some extent, a lot of the population did like Bush. And that was a positive of 9/11. Although it was horrific and thousands of people died, there was a positive that the United States became united, that they were all behind Bush's back. And then we got a mass surveillance state. Then we've got the government listening to phone calls. Then we've got the government monitoring the internet. Then we've got the wars in the Middle East. So it ended up, we had the potential to take a crisis and do something great. And I'm not saying that there should be, I'm not like an accelerationist. I'm not saying there should be a crisis so that we can do something great. I think we should do the great thing without the crisis. But the crisis has happened. So at this point, we can either use that death to get better as a country as a whole or get worse. And I think cracking down on the freedom of speech, look, I find it irreprehensible. People celebrating his death, and there are varying degrees to that, whether that's just quoting him, which I think is fine. Some people are taking his quotes out of context, which is a little bit dicey, especially, really getting into the weeds of the quotes and cutting them short. I don't like it. I still think it should be legal. And then even just memeing him. Look, I don't like it, obviously. I don't. But my First Amendment and our rights, they are tested under this circumstance. If you're not going to defend someone's right to do something you dislike, what's the First Amendment there for? Look, this is where we decide, do we really believe in the First Amendment? The First Amendment isn't so I can debate if Lamar Jackson or Josh Allen's better. That's not a controversial, well, I guess it is a controversial take, but that's not people aren't getting mad, people aren't burning down cities, people aren't emotional about that. This, burning the flag, making nasty remarks about Charlie Kirk, making nasty remarks about Joe Biden, making fun of gay, like all these different things that a lot of people are super charged up about. This is where we see if we have a First Amendment right. And I think a lot of people are kind of, they feel burnt because there was a lot of cancellation due to racism or sexism or homophobia by the Democrats in the last, in 2020, 2021, 2022. There was a lot of cancellations, and I understand that if your belief is, I guess, vengeance, they canceled us, we're going to cancel them. I understand that, but I do think it is very important to notice the distinction that, number one, J.D. Vance, who's an elected official, is calling for people to be fired. Look, the First Amendment in the Constitution, it protects the government from any retaliation. It doesn't protect me from retaliating against you, non-violently, of course. But I do think we should, as citizens, also uphold people's rights to say things that are offensive. Look, Jimmy Kimmel, Jimmy Fallon, whichever one got fired, I don't care. I don't like either of them. But Donald Trump essentially strong-arming them to fire him. They said that you will not be able to merge unless you fire him. Look, if you want to get off on technicality because they want to, ABC, they want to buy up more TV networks, and the only way they can do that is with Trump's approval. And Trump says, we'll let you become a monopoly in the media industry if you fire him. So if you want to get into semantics, if you want to say technically this isn't a First Amendment infringement because it's multi-layered, okay, fine. You get the point. The government and also the citizens, the government's more of a problem because that's what the First Amendment really protects us from. But even just the citizens, look, you don't have to like people criticizing Charlie Kirk. I don't like it either. But if we're going to give severe crackdowns on this, it spirals downward. It's the same thing with the people on the left glorifying violence. These things are downward spirals, and they don't get better. They don't get better with retaliation. Look, regardless of how it happens, both sides need to say, we're not going to glorify violence. And also, unfortunately, if you do glorify violence, we aren't going to come after you. That's just not really what the First Amendment is about. So I think both sides have some things to think about, and There are definitely options on how to improve as a country, but I don't think that is happening.